are some of the most passionate people you can ever come across. They have made such an enormous leap of faith, an enormous change in their life, and they are so intensely passionate about what they've done. And so when they're learning, they're devouring the information that they receive, and their minds aren't boxed in by the kind of constructs that we create for ourselves as we get older, whether it's from the way our parents raised us or the way we learned the religion over the years, that create these boxes, these logical frameworks that we can't think outside of without a lot of difficulty. New Muslims and people that are non-Muslims, they're able to ask questions that we may have inside of us, but we can't verbalize. We can't express them for one reason or another. And so I love to hear questions. I love people to ask those things that come up inside of them. This is the kind of forum where when you have these things nagging at you, these are the forums that you should be taking them out, to have them discussed, and to, inshallah, have somebody provide you maybe some perspective or a piece of information that helps maybe remove the doubt, or at least put it in a different light so that it creates less of a catastrophe or less of anxiety for us within our hearts. So as I was saying, part of the reason we're doing the introduction and everything right now is because we are going to be praying in like 5 minutes now. So I don't have much else. I could ramble on. Believe me, I really could. So if there's questions or anything else that people want to bring up, now is a great time to do it.
What is the name of the course?
The name of the course?
Islam Online.
Oh, the Islam Online, the Dawah training course. So if you look up Islamic Online University and or Dawah training course, you should be able to find it. And if not, I can dig up the link for you very easily. Oh, speaking of which, I forgot something. I always do this, and I'll explain part of it in a moment. Hopefully you guys can read, yes.
Can you write, with the other pen, maybe it can just visible, because you cannot read it from here.
What I'm putting on the board is my name, email, and phone number. And I told the first class the same thing because I tend to do this all the time. One of my teachers in communications, which we'll talk about communications somewhat. All right, we're going to write this again. Okay. One of my teachers in communications, when he started his class, he would hand out his business card and he would tell everyone in the class that there is a lifetime guarantee on any of his classes. If you ever need to contact him about anything related to communications, you could call him at any time. And I've done that. I've called him more than once on certain occasions because I do a lot of public speaking, and he's given me some very helpful advice in those settings. And I liked his practice of giving the lifetime guarantee and making his communication information available for all of his students. So I tend to do the same thing. Anyone who ever sits in a lecture of mine, there is, as much as I can offer something like this, a lifetime guarantee on that class, that if you have any questions about it, or you have anything that you need to contact me about related to that you can do so. And so I always try to provide my contact information. When I had business cards, I would hand out the business cards, but I'm presently in between batches of business cards, so we have to resort to writing on a board. So can people read that who need to read it? If not, you can either come and take it down directly, or I can give it to you face to face. All right, we got about 5 minutes, I think, before they're going to be making the event. Were there any other questions? The question about the course was a good question, actually. Get that out of the way. How many of you were actually at the convention where we had actively advertised this event? All right, mashallah. That means there's some here that we didn't see last week, which is even better. Promotion is good. So, I'm going to give you a general question to the group so that we're trying to use up these 5 minutes productively. What is the one thing you most would like to learn today about Dawah that you would like to see covered? Anyone? Brothers or sisters?
Mine is I like to learn how to control my emotions when the Prophet is like slandered or disrespected.
Okay. Because I have a short memory, I am going to write stuff like this down. Anything else? You guys are going to make it real easy on me if you came with no expectations, because that way I can say anything. And I can really say anything. Yes?
Giving Dawah appropriately to a person like the Catholic who try to get a consistent.
So like specific methods or things to consider? Yeah, no, great. And actually, I feel very similar to you because I grew up Protestant. And Protestants and Catholics have a lot of differences about certain things. So, and we will talk about Catholics in particular, at least in brief. Just a side note, by the way, about this. It is important to understand, especially if you are talking to people in the Hispanic community, which we need people who can talk to the Hispanic community and the Hmong community. I know there's one brother that's seriously considering learning Hmong so he can do just that. Because the Hmong probably are a very, very fertile area for us to do Dawah to, because if you know anything about the faith that they practice, they'll respond very quickly to Islam if you present it to them in a good way. As for Catholics, in Minnesota, you're not going to have as much of a need to talk to Catholics. That's not to say you won't run into Catholics, because I've talked to groups of Catholics in Minnesota, so they're actually sometimes a lot tougher than the Protestants, because they usually know a little bit more about their faith than a Protestant does. Protestants are kind of like, whatever. They take it kind of easy. But the Catholics are a little more hardcore about it. If they're practicing at all, they're usually pretty hardcore about what they believe. But there's not as many Catholics, because Minnesota, as the United States is in general, but Minnesota in particular, is a predominantly Protestant area. Lutheran in particular. We can talk about Lutherans long story. We can get off on a tangent on that. Anything else?
Yes, using the few minutes that you have.
Oh, so efficiency. Okay. Saved by the Bell. Okay. And the way I put it up here is using our time efficiently in Dawah. And one of the reasons I put in Dawah is because anyone who knows me knows I'm not very good at using my time efficiently in anything else. There's only one place I can use my time efficiently at all, is probably in Dawah. Everything else, forget about it. Ahmed can tell you very well about that.
What?
Using my time efficiently.
Oh yeah, tell me that.
Hush. Anything else? This is honestly, I really would love to hear as much as possible from you before the adhan is called, because this will help us kind of structure what we're going to talk about today, which makes it more relevant for you. So if there's anything that you really have in your mind that you would like to hear covered, or you would like to get some more insight on, now is the time.
Being concise, like not doing too much.
Right, that's a good point.
Whoops. And actually, that concept is really important, because one of the worst things we can do is to give too much information when someone's not ready for it. And that's true of new Muslims and non-Muslims. Being so patient with changes and rearrangements, etc. But hopefully everybody feels a little less hot than we were upstairs. Yeah, and one thing that we can take from this, I was explaining to the brothers that this is actually a teaching opportunity for us when it comes to the issue of giving dawah. And that's a very important point that many people never learn, which is that you need to be sensitive to all of the considerations that are going to affect a person's reception of your message. By that, what I mean, and this is from the principles of communication, which is something that I focus on a lot when I talk about dawah, because it's directly relevant to dawah. But it's something that many people, when they teach about dawah, do not discuss, because they focus on Quran and Hadith and Arkan, and this thing and that thing and the other thing, all very important, but they miss some very basic principles about how communication occurs between people. The point I'm trying to make is that when you're talking to somebody, there is a lot of different factors that in communications theory is called interference, that get in the way of them receiving the message you're trying to deliver. When you're talking to somebody, whatever the situation, especially when giving dawah, but whatever is communication, whatever message you're trying to convey to somebody, you're trying to convey a message to them. You have a specific meaning in mind that you want them to understand. But there's things that get in the way of them receiving the intended meaning. In other words, you want them to understand that green and yellow make orange. It's probably wrong. Don't have my primary colors very clear in my head right now. But that, green and yellow make orange. But they get it as green and yellow make pink, for one reason or another. So they got your message, but they didn't understand the meaning that you intended them to understand. This is how arguments sometimes occur, even when people are listening to one another. They hear you, but they don't understand you. And one of the things, amongst the many things that create interference in a communication, is environmental considerations. If you're hot, your attention is focusing, at least in part, on, damn, I'm hot. No matter how much you're interested, no matter how much attention you're trying to pay to that person, no matter how entertaining they may be, there's a part of you, depending on how uncomfortable the room may be, that's just thinking, hot. You're sweating, as I am even now. Your mind is preoccupied. And so you're not going to be paying 100% attention to what's taking place. That's just the environmental. Those are very important things. For example, to give it a more specific relevance for us, we're talking about the Ramsey County Fair. You know what today feels like right now. Today's like 90 degrees. Allah knows what the humidity is, but we know it's in double digits, somewhere probably above 50. And we're all uncomfortable. We're even inside in reasonably air-conditioned rooms. We're still a little bit uncomfortable. Now, imagine the people that are going to be at the fair. Let's even say it's a day like today. You're under a tent, potentially shaded, potentially not. I'm going to warn you in advance. Potentially not. They may be standing in the full brightness of the sun while you're trying to talk to them. Do you think all of their attention is going to be on you? Or do you think there's going to be at least a small fraction of their attention that's saying, I'm hot? Or maybe there's a snow cone vendor just down the path from your table. They're going to be thinking, man, I could use a snow cone. They're not going to be totally there with you. They're going to be uncomfortable. And depending on how uncomfortable they are, they may even be irritated. And it's not necessarily irritated at you or indisposed of receiving the message about Islam, but they're hot. And so, they're not going to be very receptive to your message. Not because the message is wrong, not because you're a bad presenter, but for one simple reason. They're hot. So this was an object lesson for us. The reason we moved is to try and reduce the distraction of being as hot as we were upstairs. That's part of the reason that we did that. So, all right, now that we've covered that, okay, I have a board coming. For those of you who were not here for the first session, very briefly, because we do have stuff that we want to cover, very briefly we're gonna talk about what are the pillars of Dawah. The basic pillars of Dawah are three things, and we are not going to go into detail about these. We went into detail last week. We don't have the time to do it this week and talk about everything else. So the basic three pillars of Dawah are three things. The call, yani the message that you have to deliver. The caller, the one delivering the message, in this case you, the da'i. And the call, the one that you're giving dawah to. Those three components. If you're missing one of those, you're not giving dawah. You're giving something else. You're not having a communication, to be honest with you. If you have no message, that means you're not talking. You're not communicating. So, no dawah is taking place. If there's no caller, no message is taking place. If there's no one to be called, there's still no message taking place. So all three of those things have to be there. The call, and what's meant by that is the call to the correct thing, which is the dawah ilallah, the call to Allah. That is what you call to. Nothing else. Not to building blocks, not to the Hanafis, not to the Hanbalis, not to Isna, not to Ikna, not to Masjid Al-Huda, not to Dar Farouk, not to Abu Bakr. You're calling to Allah. You're not calling to your opinion, you're calling to Allah. You're calling to what Allah tells us in the Quran, what the Prophet tells us in his authentic Sunnah. That is what you're calling to. Nothing else. The caller, obviously you, and there's things that as a caller we need to be conscious about, and things, qualities we should have. Not the least of which is knowledge and sincerity. There's a lot of others, but knowledge and sincerity are amongst the most important that we could have. And by knowledge, I want to underline, I want to add a word to knowledge for all you who are writing stuff down. It's not just knowledge, because people can have knowledge but not have faith in that knowledge, not trust in that knowledge, not have it transform them into believers. What you need is certain knowledge. Knowledge that your heart has settled with, that you believe in, absolutely. That you, in Arabic we would say, you make tasdeeq, you testify to the truthfulness of that knowledge. It is absolutely paramount. Anything that you're wishy-washy about, you're not clear about, you have your own personal doubts about, don't try and have those conversations with people. Because you know what's going to happen? You're either going to create confusion for them and you, or they're going to ask you a question that gives you even more of a problem. You're going to have a crisis of faith because of something they say to you. So stick to the things you know, and you know with certainty, that your heart is settled with, that you can testify to the truth of these things. And then sincerity. Sincerity should be self-evident. Sincerity is a topic all by itself. So those three things are most important. All right, it's up a little late. Do people need me to write it down? You pretty much all have got it. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, good. All right. Now, we are going to cover, and I'm going to try and go over things after. Yes. Can you do me a favor?
Yes.
Go upstairs and jot down all of the stuff that was on the board, the people's questions.
Write it down, I mean?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
I want to make sure that I answer the things that you brought up that we were writing on the board. I don't want to forget those. So we're going to talk over things at a relatively high level because there's a lot of material in this section. One of the first sections that Sheikh Bilal talks about is general questions or general issues, stuff that gets brought up frequently. At least in his experience, these were things that got brought up frequently. And he brings a lot of explanation as to why these things are non-issues, but we're not going to take all of his points. They're really good, and I would encourage you to find the information, or look up the information on at the course on Islamic Online University, or for that matter, to give fair billing. The Islamic University of Minnesota has a course, Usul Dawah, which is an in-depth course on Dawah. So that's another option. Islamic Online University, all one word, .com. So the first one that he mentions is the issue that many non-Muslims have, where they say, Muslim men are polygamists. Officially, technically, it's polygynist, but we won't get into the whole linguistic issue about that. So the idea that Muslim men are accused of being promiscuous and lecherous because they always want 4 wives. There was a story that Sheikh Bilal tells about a man in England who had been interested in Islam for years, but he was always holding back from committing to Islam. And when Sheikh Bilal asked him one time, he said, I'm really convinced about Islam, but I love my wife. He's like, I don't want to take another wife. Because in his mind, you had to take 4 wives the minute you became Muslim. You had to take 4 wives. And so he was like, but I love my wife. I don't want to take another wife. I love my wife. And so that was his barrier. His barrier was this belief in his head that taking 4 wives was mandatory. So the simplest, I actually don't have to read a lot of these because I've heard his lectures about these so often. One of the points, and he brings up many, many points about the issue of this belief that Muslim men are polygamous and that they have this lecherous sexual nature to them, where they don't have the self-restraint that other monogamous men have. And just as a side point, the whole issue of monogamy in the West, first, monogamy was promoted by Greco-Roman culture. The Greco-Romans, on the law books, you could only have 1 wife. But in practice, they were allowed to have as many concubines and as many mistresses as they wanted. And there was no legal ramification for that at all. So they were monogamous on paper, according to the law, but in practice, they were sleeping around with anything that moved. Sound familiar? Sounds like the West, which makes perfect sense when you look at the fact that Western society is essentially based on Greco-Roman culture. And so the fact that there's a lot of similarities is very, very easy to make the connection for. But one of the points that he makes, actually, another point, so many of these things. There was a research done on sexual habits of men and women in the United States some years ago. Right now I'm drawing a blank on the name of the study. But in it, if my memory serves, 80% of the men surveyed, married men, had had extramarital affairs. I know some of the women are probably going, no surprise. But 60% of the women had had extramarital affairs as well. So this was the levels to which this disrespect for the institution of marriage and the sanctity of the family had penetrated. And this was a while ago. This was, a few decades ago that this study was done. The rates now are probably much higher. But one of the points that he makes regarding this whole idea of men being polygamous and this nature is that amongst the reasons that men having more than one wife was permitted was, if you look worldwide, the number of women outnumbers the men. Simple mathematics. In most countries, the women are over 50% of the population, the men less than. Do the math. If every woman is expected to only be married to, if every man is only going to be married to one woman, what does that leave for the other women left over? Because there's not enough men to marry all the women. That means that some of the women in society are going to be forced into illicit relationships or be completely without partners of any kind whatsoever. Oh, thank you. Okay. What is this note? So there's a fundamental mathematical flaw just in that alone. If you accept the premise that intimate relations between a man and woman should take place in the bonds of marriage, and you still maintain that one man, one woman is the rule, then what you have done is you have sentenced hundreds and thousands, maybe millions of women around the world to be living in sin or living completely alone. Simple mathematics. And the reasons for the rates is very obvious. I mean, you look at it historically, especially, men were the ones who fought the wars primarily. They were the ones getting killed off in large numbers many times. They were prone to more violent, to being the victims of more violence, even outside of wartime. And just from a physiological standpoint, men do not live as long as women. Even in the United States, I just saw the numbers recently. Men can expect to live to be 70-point-something years old in the United States as of today. Women, 77. So if a woman's husband dies and she still wants the companionship, etc., what is she supposed to do? If all the other men are married up, there's no one else available in her town, in her city, in her community, whatever. She's supposed to live, by herself, be unfulfilled, or to have to resort to, lecherous behavior and, inappropriate behavior, or she's allowed to marry into a family where there's already a man with one wife and he's willing to take a second wife. And I say willing because if you look, even in the Muslim countries where this is permitted, the rates of plural marriages, how high do you think the rates of plural marriages in Muslim countries are? It's permitted. It's allowed. There's no law against it. There's no retribution. There's no even societal pressure against it.
3%, 5%. I think it's less than that.
Generally about 10%. 10 to 15%. And this is even in the countries or in the areas where people are very rich, etc. They don't take it. They don't take it. Even when the permission is there, there's no barrier to them practicing that. They don't take it. Why? Because the law set limits on it in the Quran himself. Very simply, he says you have to do justice to all of your wives. It's not simply you take whoever you want, you treat them however you want, you support one, you don't support the other. There's a responsibility. So when people understand it the way it's meant to be, and the facts behind it, they may not change their opinion about multiple marriages, but they at least have a very much more modified stance on the issue. Then arranged marriages. This is another one that you hear people talk about. You hear it's not so common in certain areas, but especially from my experience, Pakistan and India and places like that, it's very common for families to arrange marriages. Even the people have not seen each other before the day of the marriage, ever met each other. So there oftentimes Muslims are accused of forcing their women into marriage. Now, most of us, we should know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he states very clearly that the permission of even the virgins should be sought. In other words, a woman has to give her consent to be married off to someone. And if she's already been married once before, then she has the right to refuse outright. So this idea of being forced into marriage, can we say that it doesn't happen? No, we can't say it doesn't happen. It absolutely happens. We know it happens. But is it something that represents the true teachings of Islam, the correct understanding of the practices of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? No, absolutely not. That's very easy to establish. So it's something that we should understand. And this seems strange to people, the idea of parents having to approve a child's marriage, because in the West, kids get to be their teenage years, parents are ready to kick them out of the door at a moment's notice, and they're left to fend for themselves. And so for the parents then to step in on the back end, and when they reach 20 or something like that, and they want to get married and say, well, no, you have to get my approval to marry that person, etc. Most of the kids are like, I've been taking care of myself for the last 6 years, Dad. What right do you have to tell me what to do? And even from a logical standpoint, it makes some sense why that would seem very strange to them. But that isn't the way most Muslim societies are. Families stay together much longer. Families are much larger, much more extended, which is something that the West has lost. And the idea that Muslim women cannot marry themselves. We're talking about that. The father must approve, or the wali must approve of the marriage, and the same reasons. That the Muslim women, they say the Muslim women in very traditional societies, especially outside of the major metropolitan areas, many of our Muslim sisters, they live very sheltered lives. They are basically homemakers most of the time, and they're living within a very sheltered existence where they're not having to deal with the vicissitudes of life that other people have to deal with, that the men have to deal with, being involved in business and traveling and all of these other things, etc. Which is why they create these things, because they don't understand men, because they don't have contact with men. In most Muslim societies, we know what things are like. The men and the women are separated, to a great degree, and so the women, they don't understand men the way that men understand them. We're with them all the time. We grew up with them. We know what they're like. We know what they're like in the locker room. We know what they're like, in the back of the bus. We know what men are like. Women don't necessarily know what they're like, and they can be fooled by the way men behave. And trust me, men can be tricky, especially when they want something. They can say the sweetest things in the world. They can make you feel like you're flying high. And even they might believe what they're saying to you, but then something will change, reality will kick in, and it'll be different. But a man, being a man like him, he might hear those words, you'll hear the words, you'll be like, oh, mashallah. But your father's like, that guy's a joker, he ain't coming near you. Because he can see something you can't see. He senses something that you don't sense, for one reason or another. When our emotions get involved, and most of us have heard the phrase, love is blind. It's very true. When we begin to fall in love, we lose the ability to judge objectively. Very frequently, people find that the person they fell in love with and they thought was the perfect one, and it was going to be forever, and it was in the stars, and then a year or 2, 3, 5 down the road, suddenly all these things start to come up. All these personality flaws start to show up. And they're wondering, who are you? You're not the man I met. You're not the man I married. You're not the woman I met. And the reality is they are exactly the same person you met. They're exactly the same person you married, but at that time you had your blinders on. You didn't want to see the flaws. You didn't want to see the errors, the mistakes, and the warning signs, because, and so you look past it. And that's one of the reasons that this practice of the wali being there is to protect against those things happening. And the other thing, and Sheikh Walal makes this point frequently, and it's something that hopefully we don't lose in the West, which is that traditionally in Islam, marriages are not marriages of a husband and a wife. The marriages are marriages of families. The wife's family and the husband's family, they're merging. They're forging ties, which one hopes will last their lifetime. And even in the Quran, when you see if there's disputes between a man and a woman, Allah instructs the people to find a person to judge from her family and a person to judge from his family. The idea being is that the families have the most vested interest in keeping that family alive and keeping that family going and keeping it strong. Outsiders aren't going to be as attached. They're not going to have personal connections with you. They're not going to have personal feelings for the relationship maintaining, because it's something that the families, it's not just you two that are separating, the families are separating. And the bonds are being forged across not just your two hearts and your two lives, but against all of the lives that are involved. And so these factors are what make these things very important. These are what have historically helped keep the marriages in the Islamic world much stronger. Sadly, as many people will see in the rates of divorce in Muslim countries, unfortunately that's being reversed, because unfortunately many of the countries overseas, they're following in the West's footsteps. Granted, they're many years behind where the West is presently, but they're still following behind, and so the divorce rates are going up and up. And there's an accusation of a double standard in marriages, where men are allowed to marry non-Muslim females, but Muslim females are not allowed to marry non-Muslim males. This is one that I know a lot of people bring up, especially here, because many of you are in public schools or public universities, and so you're forced into interaction with non-Muslims. And let's be honest, not everybody is, hates the Muslims or is out to kill them or anything else. Many of them are, can be very nice, can be very understanding, can be very, very sweet, and may find the Muslim women very attractive for one reason or another. But the women are not allowed to have those relationships. The men are generally allowed to marry non-Muslims, but even that, many people don't know this if they haven't looked into it. Even that permission to marry non-Muslims, many scholars argue against that being permissible, or at the very least recommended, in a society where the Muslims are the minority. Because if they marry and then problems arise or divorce ensues and there's children involved, who's going to be favored by the society and by the system? The non-Muslim. And in Islam, that wouldn't be appropriate, because the non-Muslims are never supposed to be given power over the Muslims. And by definition, that means that non-Muslim parents should never be the ones given sole custody of a Muslim child. Because what happens? I know that this doesn't happen every single time, but most of the time, when a non-Muslim parent is raising children from a mixed marriage, they raise them as what? Non-Muslims, of course. Now, I can tell you for a fact, believe it or not, I do know some non-Muslim households where they were married to Muslims and they're still raising the kids as Muslims. They're allowing them to grow up with an Islamic identity. Allah knows what guided them to that decision. But it does happen. But the norm is that is not what's going to happen. They're going to give them the background and the upbringing that they had. And so it's something we have to be very, very, aware of. And this is one of the reasons why, men need to understand. Not only is it that, men are discouraged from doing that in a setting like the West, but at the same time, it's not just marry any non-Muslim you feel like, as a man. The attribute of muhsanat is on there as well. And muhsanat is one that is chaste, that is pure. Meaning, just because she says she's Christian, that doesn't mean that she's an equal opportunity for you. Because if she's sleeping around, if she's out, taking boyfriends left and right, guess what? No, she's off the table. Muhsanat, righteous women. And as Sheikh Walal likes to put it, finding the muhsanat amongst the non-Muslims in Western society is like finding a needle in a haystack. Nearly impossible. It becomes, I know in my lifetime, and that was some years ago, when we got into junior high, which is like 12 years old, 11 years old, people were already talking about they were out, sleeping around, doing stuff like this at 11 and 12. And this was in my day, which was back in the early 80s. We're talking over 20 years ago. I guarantee you things have changed, and I sincerely doubt they changed for the better. Finding that muhsanat amongst the non-Muslims is going to be extremely difficult. And leaving all that aside, this is turning into a lecture to the men rather than to the women at this point. Leaving all that aside, Allah tells us in the Quran that these ones that disbelieve, they invite us to what? The fire. It's common sense if you think about it. If you, especially as a revert, from my standpoint as a revert, I never have seriously considered a non-Muslim female. Even the people I knew back in high school and stuff like that were very close to me. I never considered them after I became Muslim because in my mind, this is where they are. I've turned from that and I'm heading off in this direction. They're moving straight ahead or they're going further off in the other direction. Why on earth would I want to be with somebody that's going to take me off course? That's going to mislead me and going to land me in a destination other than the one I want for myself and for my family. Why? Quite simply. So for the sisters, marrying them is not permissible for you, but there's a very good reason for it. Because think about it. As a Muslim man, if he marries a non-Muslim woman, and he asks her, let's say she's Christian or she's Jew, he asks her, don't eat pork. As a Christian, would that be against her religion to not eat pork? No. There's actually passages in the Bible that are very clear about Jesus' stance on pork and the position in the Old Testament about the stance on pork. A Jewish woman, if she was told by her Muslim husband, don't eat pork, is that against her religion? No, quite actually, it's asking her to abide by her religion. If he asked her, don't wear miniskirts, don't wear revealing clothing, is that somehow asking her to do something that's against the teachings of her faith? No, it's not. Don't kiss my friends, don't hug my friends. It's not appropriate. Is that somehow violating her religious rights or her religious beliefs? No. Now flip the coin. Let's say a Muslim sister marries a non-Muslim man. He's your average non-Muslim man. He says, I need you to go down to the corner store and buy me some 40s, some 8-ball. May you not know what these are. These are alcoholic drinks. Some gin, some whatever. Bring it back for dinner tonight. I'm inviting some friends over. Oh, and change into that really slinky dress I bought you the other day. And when they come in, I want you to make sure you hug them and you give them a kiss on the cheek, etc. All of this stuff, is this stuff against your religion and against your beliefs? Absolutely. Absolutely. A Muslim man marrying a non-Muslim woman is not going to jeopardize her faith or her beliefs. But if you're put in a situation where you're married to a non-Muslim man, stuff that he takes for granted, that he thinks is permissible for himself, and he asks you to do, is absolutely, categorically forbidden to you. But you as a woman, even if you are trying to be on your deen, but you're married to this man, you love this man, even if you're trying to be on your deen, are you going to weaken? Are you going to feel this nagging feeling that maybe I should do what my husband's asking me to be? It's just, this. It's not. It's not. Other people can't see me. It's just in the house. It's this. Whatever. You're going to want to make your husband happy. And so, if gradually your deen becomes more and more jeopardized because of it, because you're being forced to compromise to please your husband, which is a natural feeling. A wife should want to please her husband in the same way a husband should want to please his wife. But if doing so is going to make them violate their beliefs, their faith, and their structure, what kind of relationship is that?
Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine, thank you.
Good.
Very sexy voice, by the way. So, hopefully that helps shed a little light on this idea of a double standard in marriage and why there's some good reasons to say there's a reason to say not do it. Aside from the fact that Allah tells us in the Quran not to do it. And those of you who were in the session last week, I told you that there's different. You were asking about ways to open up conversations about dawah in a work setting or somewhere like that. I always used to answer people in a work setting when they'd ask me, like, why do you pray? Why do you wear a beard? Why do you dress that way? Because I used to wear like camise all the time when I was on the job, and I wasn't like hounding them. I wasn't like just pounding on their leg. Hey, you want to learn about Islam? They would ask me. I would create the opportunity for them to ask by not being shy about my Islam. And quite simply, that's one of the most effective tools you can use. Don't be shy about your Islam. The sisters know this better than the brothers do. The majority of us, if we took off our kufis, those of us who put on our kufis today, or took off our thobes, and put on those t-shirts we know we wear when we're at home or something like that, we'd disappear into the framework. No one would recognize us. No one would bother to ask. If we weren't making it known by our actions that we were Muslim, no one would ask if we were Muslim. No one would care if we were Muslim. But the minute you put on the kufi, the minute you put on the thobe, or the sister's case, those that are practicing, mashallah, the minute you walk out the door, they know. You can't be shy, because they see it right away. And what happens? Inevitably, they ask questions. Aren't you hot? I'm sure some of you are going to get that at the county fair, because it's going to be hot no matter what. But it starts conversations. And giving people the opportunity to ask and not to feel like they're being pressured oftentimes makes for the most useful and effective conversations. Now, this idea that divorce is easy in Islam. In comparison to a Western divorce, yeah, sure, it's easy. Because a Western divorce is going to cost you thousands of dollars, take many, many months and sometimes years, and you're going to be fighting the whole way, tooth and nail. If you're not fighting, people think something's wrong with you. In Islam, it doesn't take that amount of time. You're specifically told you should not be fighting during the whole process. Keep them in kindness or release them in kindness, as Allah tells us. And yes, it takes one pronouncement of divorce and a waiting period of 3 cycles or 3 months, but there's rules. If you say it in rage, according to many scholars, it doesn't count. If you say it when the woman is on her cycle, it doesn't count. If you say it during a period of time where the two of you have been intimate together, it doesn't count. You're supposed to live together after the pronouncement of divorce during those 3 months in order to offer an opportunity for what?
Reconciliation.
Reconciliation. Islam builds the whole structure so that the family is maintained. And so that the hot-headedness that we display many times, the impatience that we show many times, can be mitigated by the opportunity that we have to wait. The opportunity that we have to remember, you know, she really ticked me off, but damn, I love that woman. You know, I mean, it sounds funny, but you really do. I mean, there'll be times when you love people, and I think I said this last week. One of the things that's very, very interesting to find, and I think if all of us think about this brief point for a moment, the people we have the largest arguments with, the loudest, most passionate, most knockdown, drag-out arguments with, if you think about it, are the people that are close to us. Family, close friends, people that really matter in our hearts. The reason being is that a perfect stranger, if he says, you know what, you're an idiot, most of us aren't going to care. Like, who are you? But if your best friend comes up to you and with all seriousness is like, look man, you're an idiot, you're actually going to feel that. You're going to feel it, and if it's at the wrong time, you're probably going to get angry, or you're going to shoot back, because that person's opinion of you matters to you. And so their words hurt you. And so it's one of the most unique ironies that the people we love the most are the ones that we can hate the most as well. Because when they disappoint us, the disappointment hurts more than anything else. When they say things to hurt us, the pain we feel is much deeper than anyone else. So it's very, very, important, this idea that we rectify that we experience these things, we feel these pains because of the closeness of our relationship, but we allow ourselves the time, to get over it. To not let it, so it's like if you're feeling some pain, but it's because of something that was said just casually or something like that, it's like you get over it, and you're like, it really wasn't that serious, I probably didn't need to be so upset with it. But then the stuff that sticks with you, the stuff that you can't forget, you can't get over, that you can't forgive after 3 months, then maybe it is better. Because otherwise what's going to happen? You're going to live in misery, potentially. Hating the person you're with. And it's not totally out of the woman's hands. Many women, they know about khula, which is a divorce that is initiated by the woman. She essentially, they translate it as ransoms herself, which I don't like the connotation of that, but it's relatively accurate in its meaning. The idea is that she returns some portion of the mahar that she was given, or something like that, some compensation to the man to say, I really want out of this. How about I give you back whatever, so you'll just let me go. And the man, accepts that and lets her go. So she can initiate that. But in the same way with khula, as it is with talaq for the man, we're strongly discouraged from entering into them casually, or just carelessly, playing with this whole thing. Because it's very hurtful. It causes enormous damage to relationship if people play with this. If I come home and dinner isn't ready, you're divorced. The tea's too hot, you're divorced. is very dangerous to play with stuff like that, because imagine what it does to someone. Just like what we were talking about a moment ago, the way when people say things to you that you care about, how much they hurt. How much do you think it hurts someone to hear that? Even if they don't expect them to actually do it, to hear it, it starts to imprint on a person's mind and affect their self-esteem in the relationship, everything. And then on top of that, what many people don't know is it is possible for a man to give his wife the permission and the power to pronounce divorce herself. They can do that at the time of the marriage, or they can do that later on in the marriage and say, you know what, I give you the permission to pronounce divorce, one time or whatever. And she can be the one to say, I divorce you. That's permissible. And if you don't know where it comes from, I'm paraphrasing it because I don't remember the verses, but in the Quran, if you remember, where the Prophet ﷺ, he removed himself from all of his wives for 29 days. During that time, there was an ayah of Quran that came down. He's offering the wives of the Prophet a choice, whether they wanted to be freed to pursue the dunya, or if they wanted to stay with Allah and His Messenger. So they were given the choice. You can choose. Do you want to stay married or not? In your hands. No ransom required, nothing like that. You're given a choice. So it's not totally out of a woman's hands. And if a man is being too obstinate, even the judge can take it out of his hands. If a woman takes her case to court and the judge sees that the man's being obstinate, being unfair, he can take it out of his hands and divorce her himself and make the man separate from her. So it's not quite as difficult as it seems. And there's things in place to help prevent the type of fracture of marriage that you see in the West. And the idea that Muslim women are oppressed by the Islamic dress code. This is, of course, a famous one that people love. And this is something that obviously the sisters all are very familiar with, because they're all, mashallah, they're dressed very well. One of the things that you find, there's some reports that have been done. They've compared the changing fashion trends, specifically the raising of the skirt hems, the popularity of shorter and shorter skirt hems, to the point where you get to these micro minis and things like that. Some of you may not know even what a micro mini is, but a micro mini basically is like wrapping a belt of cloth around your waist and calling it a skirt. With the rising hemlines, as the hemlines got higher and higher and higher, the rates of sexual abuse and rape went up and up and up. Very, very well established. And another point, a logic that he gives, is this idea that in a Muslim society, a woman is asked to cover, and cover in a way that makes her, not an object of sensual distraction. And at the same time, there's a very severe punishment for people that abuse them or molest them. And it makes perfect sense when you think, if you can't see what a woman is presenting, what her body looks like, what are you doing? What type of perversity are you upon, that you're going to come to a woman that's fully clothed and fully draped, and you're going to try and undress her and to molest her against her will? How grievous, how awful, what type of personality is capable of something like that? But then in the West, what you find people are told basically you can walk around, in almost any condition you want. He cites examples in Canada and some other places where women have challenged the rules against walking topless, and won. That they could walk topless out in public. And he says, so you got that in the summer, especially even in Minnesota, you know what the women dress like. If they were wearing bikinis, they might actually be more dressed than they are sometimes in what they wear. But then at the same time, society tells the men, don't touch, don't look, don't look too long, don't. You're letting these women walk around stark naked and behave any way they choose as well. There's no restrictions on the perversity of their behavior or their language or how they interact with people. And then you get mad at the men because they get attracted to something that you're letting them say, make yourselves as attractive as you want, make yourself as sensual and as sexual and as tempting and be as flirtatious as you want. The men don't touch. And then when you touch, it's like a big billboard that says, touch me, you touch, then what? You get charged with rape, you get charged with this, you get charged with that. It's a complete confusion. For a man to try and attack a woman that's dressed like our sisters are, there's real perversity here. And the severity of the punishment for that type of behavior is very severe in Islam. We know that. It's very severe in Islam. And if they use any type of force or weapons in that, they're killed. But in the States, even they choke, they stab, they're going after and raping these women, relentlessly. And these are women that are dressed in these party dresses and everything else. They're coming out of nightclubs, drunk and flirting with everything that moves, etc., etc. And then a man touches them, and they don't, and they attack them for it. And in their mind, they're like, why should a man be killed for something like that? Well, it's like, yeah, it doesn't make sense to you because you're basically throwing your women out naked on display and saying, here, have a look. Touch when I'm not looking, but, So it's this lack of logic, this idea that it's exposing these women to greater and greater harm. And this is exactly what the ayah in the Quran in Surah Al-Ahzab says, that it's in order for the women to be known and recognized and what?
Not what?
Not harmed. Not harmed. The idea of a double standard in inheritance. Some of you have heard this idea of that two men equal one woman in the standpoint of inheritance. A man gets 2 shares for every share for a woman. That's not true in every case, first and foremost. In the case of brothers and sisters, they will share a third amongst themselves. There's not a double, 2 for 1 type of deal there. And the other reason, this is why understanding Islam as a totality is very important. Because when you look at the inheritance, but you understand the issue in the whole context of Islam as a religion and as a way of life, men are responsible for what? In a perfect world, men are responsible for the maintenance and the care, and the upbringing, and the providence for all of their family members, especially the women folk. Whether it's their wives or their sisters or their mothers, all of them. If there's no one else to care for them, then it falls on the males in that family. And so they have the responsibility of caring for themselves and for others. There is a religious obligation upon them. And so for them to be given equal shares in inheritance, but then be asked to have double the expenses, triple the expenses, does that sound like justice? You say, I'm going to give both of you $5. I'm going to give you a bag of candy. You got to go buy your own. There's not justice in that. The woman is given some protection, is given some guarantee that she'll be cared for. In a fully functioning Islamic society, the woman should always be cared for. And she always be preserved and protected and treasured. Now, granted, most of our societies, even in Muslim countries, aren't functioning in this fashion very well these days. But that's the ideal. That's the standard. That's why sometimes people misunderstand small segments of Islam because they look at it from a very microscopic view. They don't see it in the context of the whole. Because when you see those things in the context of the whole religion of Al-Islam, they make sense. But when you try and single them out and set them off to the side and put them under a microscope and say, look at this. Dang, Muslims, womanizers, chauvinists, pedophiles. It doesn't make sense because they're trying to look at something completely out of context. That's like to take a 5-minute speech and then grab one sentence out of the middle of the speech and use that to try and say this is what he was saying the entire 5 minutes. It's never going to be accurate. Even if that one sentence was supposed to be a summary of everything he said, it's still not going to capture everything. It's still going to be a dim reflection of everything. And you're going to have misunderstandings abounding because of it. And the 2 men equal 1 woman in the witness, the verse that talks about this is specific about business transactions. And the thing about this is that in that time, and even in this time, the majority of women around the world are at home, homemakers, caring for family, caring for the homestead, etc. They're not out involved in business and trade and things of this nature. If you look at worldwide, that is the norm. In America, it might be a little different because of the demographics, but even in America, there's a large percentage of women that are basically homemakers. That is their avocation. That is what they do. Even they might have great educations, but for whatever reason, they settled into a homemaker's role, and decided to take on the greatest task and the greatest responsibility, and use the gifts that they've been given in the place that they're the most valuable. So these verses that talk about, if you get 2 witnesses amongst the men, and if not 2 men, then a man and 2 women whom you trust. And the idea is that the women in general are not involved in business. They're not, well informed in business matters. So it would be something that would be difficult for them to comprehend and understand. And so they're there to help reinforce one another. Because the rules are made not for specific cases. Like, this one woman, she might be an expert business person. But the generality of women around the world, the opposite is true. The men are the ones with the business savvy, and the women are the ones that have the ability with homemaking and child rearing and things like that. It's the nature of humanity as a whole, statistically, and it's the way Allah created each of us in the species to have certain abilities that are best suited in certain areas. It's not to say we're incapable in other areas, but we've been given special gifts in certain areas. Which is why, as we know, the woman is the one described as being the one that has an abundant share of rahmah, of mercy, which is why she is so effective at raising the children. Not to say fathers are incapable of raising children, but there's a special quality in mothers that can't be found in most fathers. Does that mean no father has an abundant share of mercy the way a mother might? No. But that father would be an exception, not the rule. Whereas with the mothers, it's the rule, not the exception. So, in business transactions, it's 2 women to 1 man, but a single woman's testimony is sufficient in some matters. Like in the matter of child rearing and suckling. Like if a woman has suckled two children for another family, and those children eventually try to get married later on. And there's an example from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ where 2 people came to them and they said, this slave woman is saying that she suckled the both of us. And the Prophet's response was essentially, he's like, what are you going to do with her testimony? Like, it's sufficient. He separated the 2 of them based on that one single woman's testimony. Because in that matter, as to who suckled who's going to have better knowledge than the one whose breast was being used to suckle? In a similar way, a woman's testimony as to her menses. You honestly think that someone's going to come and say, no, we need to check. SubhanAllah. A woman's testimony regarding her menses is accepted as valid under the majority of circumstances. If she says, my menses started, okay. My menses ended, okay. In the cases of divorce and etc., it's based on her witnessing to that fact, because who else is going to know? Who else? We're not going to like try and get under a woman's dress and say, all right, no, we need proof. That's not subhanAllah, that's not the way it works. Islam isn't shameless in that way. We take the woman's testimony, and the weight is on the woman to tell the truth, knowing all of the advices and the admonishments that Allah and His Messenger have made towards truthfulness, and the consequences for lying about those things and concealing those things, like what is in their womb if they're pregnant. So the burden then is on them. So it's not necessarily a blessing. In some ways, it's a burden because you're the witness. Your witness is sufficient all by itself. That means you're also the sole one responsible for your witness as well. Meaning that if your witness is inaccurate or untruthful, you bear the sole responsibility for that. So it's very important. It's not witness is not something that people should be racing for. As I want to be able to be a witness. No, one of the signs of the coming of the end of days is people giving witness when they're not asked to. So it's not something that people should be rushing to and feeling that somehow they're being deprived. It's like many people who understand the issue of being a witness for something, they're very reluctant to be witnesses because they understand it's a responsibility. It's an amana that they're taking in front of Allah and in front of the people that they need to discharge faithfully. The idea that Islam was spread by the sword, that's a famous one that we all know. That's the last one we cover on this section right here. This idea that Islam was spread by the sword is ludicrous from a whole bunch of different standpoints. Many historians will tell you the ludicrousness of that. Sheikh Hatem has some magnificent material on this stuff regarding quotes from bishops from the Christian church in like Antioch and places like that in the Middle East when the Muslims came into their cities, deposing the Romans. And these bishops, these Christian bishops, leaders of the church in those cities, were writing in praise of the Muslims and how grateful they were that the Muslims were coming and how merciful they were in comparison to their Roman counterparts. And mind you, the Romans at that time were Christians like they were, but they were oppressive. And so although they're co-religionists, as they use the term, their Christian brothers from the Romans were the ones in charge. They were oppressive. And when the Muslims came and deposed the Romans from Antioch and from other places within the Middle East, many of the bishops wrote praises of them, talking about how wonderful it was and how merciful, how just they were and everything else. This is the evidence to say that Islam was not spread by the sword and these people weren't being subjugated. They were welcoming them in. They were practically opening the gates of the city to them, saying, please come in. Even at one point, one of the stories he gives, just to give you an idea of the nature of the Muslims and the way they kept their trust, the Muslims were occupying a town where they were in charge, and it was a non-Muslim town, and it was in the middle of time when they were at war with the Romans still, and things were going bad for the Muslims. The Romans were building their forces and were moving to attack a city close to where they were. And so they actually gave the money back, the jizya, that the non-Muslims had been paying to them for the defense of the city and themselves, gave it back to them, saying that we can no longer, abide by our end of the agreement. So we're giving you back the money. And they were sad to see them go. They wanted them to stay. And so they gave them back the jizya that they had paid, because it was paid on condition that they're defending them and they're protecting them within the borders of their city to go and fight that battle. And the Christians were so disappointed and were so unhappy to see them go, because they knew that opened up the possibility for them to be oppressed again by the Romans if they took the city over. These are the kind of history stories that you have. And then there's the reality of many parts of West Africa never saw a Muslim army. The majority of far Southeast Asia never saw a Muslim army. Indonesia, Malaysia, all of these different areas never saw a Muslim army. It was all spread by trade and by people like this. Many of you have heard this many times before. It shouldn't be anything new to you. So this idea that it's spread by the sword is ludicrous, and really it's kind of a holdover from the Crusades, because this was the image that the Pope and the Christians were creating at the time of the Crusades to whip the people up into this frenzy of looking at these people as infidels. I mean, they make fun of us of calling non-Muslims infidels and not disbelievers, etc. The Christians were doing the same thing. The word infidel came from them, not from us. They used the term for us. And they were using it in the same way they accuse Muslims now of using these terms. That's exactly the way they were using it during the time of the Crusades. Talking about going to kill the infidels. If any of you have ever seen Kingdom of Heaven, which is a cinematic movie about the Crusade, about a period during the Crusades, there's a scene where they're walking along. There's a scene where they're walking along the road, heading towards the port in Italy, where they sail from to go to the Holy Land, and they're passing by monks and bishops from the church along the road. That as they're going, it goes, the Pope has said it's not a sin to kill an infidel; it's the path to heaven. And this was exactly what they were teaching. They were telling all of the soldiers that were going. This was the mentality. So there's plenty of bloodiness and bloodthirstiness on the side of the Christians, much more than anyone could ever point to on the side of the Muslims. If you look at history, if you look at their scripture, just use common sense. So you should never feel apologetic for those things. Now, we've eaten up a lot of time here. Let me look at the questions that we had real quick, so make sure we cover some of those before we run out, because we're coming tight on time. Do people want to take a quick break, drinks or bathroom or anything like that, or are we just fine, just plow ahead? I'll take your silence as a acquiescence. Okay, the 4 things that we had written down from our questions upstairs before we went for Salah. The first one was about controlling emotions when slandered. It is very important that we control our emotions when slandered, and as a couple people alluded to, I don't think Sarah's heard today, but she was talking about how she had some negative experiences with some people as well. One of the things that I always am amazed about how people get such a knee-jerk reaction to this when they hear people slander the Prophet, when they hear people say negative things about Islam. People, let's use our minds for a second. Who is the best creation ever created on the face of the earth? Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Who do we find in the Quran? It's called a magician. It's called a sorcerer. It's called a liar. It's called a poet. It's called insane. Who's poisoned, attempted to be murdered more than once, fought against who? Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I marvel at how people are so shocked and so overwhelmed when people say negative things about Islam and about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We're 1,400 years later. We are the absolute dimmest reflection of Islam and its values and its magnificent qualities in comparison to the companions. We do not have Al-Mustafa in our midst. Why are we surprised that people are going to lampoon us, that they're going to say bad things about us? They're going to call. I mean, I think of the impatience that some of the companions showed in Mecca when they were saying, "Oh, Prophet of Allah, when is Allah going to grant us victory? When are we going to be able to come back? We're suffering so much." And he would show them. Some of you know the stories of Khabab ibn al-Arat. He was tortured so much in his lifetime while he was in Mecca. They used to take him out to the desert, tie him down on the ground, and put hot coals on his back, to the point that they burned through his skin down to his flesh. They said in the hadith, it says you could smell his fat burning. And he came to the Prophet one time, impatient for the victory. And he was showing him his back. And he said, he was saying, there were people before you who could be buried up to their necks and have a saw placed in the middle of their head, being commanded to leave their faith, and they wouldn't budge an inch, and they were on Dalala. They would have iron combs brought and scrape the very meat off their bones, but they would never turn from the ignorance and the misguidance that they were upon. Why are we so impatient? Why are we so unwilling to face difficulty? Are we going to maintain our Islam on the edge of a knife? The minute something scratches our foot, pricks our arm, we're going to jump off because it's too much? Do you think patience is only being patient when people are being sweet and are being polite? SubhanAllah, patience is when we're faced with the most vehement and vile and despicable opposition, and we maintain our composure. We maintain our calm. We maintain our intellect and our faith. Because we know they were patient in the midst of the afflictions they faced, and eventually they saw what? Allahu Akbar, they saw victory. They saw magnificent victory. And they became such examples that people traveled hundreds, even thousands of miles just to sit with them sometimes. The companions. We're not even talking about Al-Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Don't undersell yourselves. Do not doubt yourselves to such an extent that you let fear hold you back. One of the most powerful things you'll find when you're talking to people is a tenacious confidence in what you're saying, what you're talking about. By that I don't mean that you have to be scholars about what you say. By that I don't mean that you have to have perfect diction, lack of an accent, or the ability to make mental gymnastics with the insights and the hidden mystical realities of the things you're talking about. I mean plain and simple, from the gut, the depths of your heart, sincerity. Straightforward, honest. Don't worry if you stumble in what you say. Don't worry if you don't know the words. Just communicate what you believe in the depth of your heart. And if they reject you, know that far better than you were rejected before. Far more eloquent, far more intelligent, far more capable at delivering that message. And they were rejected. The Prophet ﷺ was rejected by his family, by even one of the most beloved people to him, his uncle Abu Talib, who he prayed and hoped for till the very last breath of his uncle's life that he would come to Islam, and he never did. Never did. On his deathbed, he denied the message. If that's the case for the Prophet ﷺ, we shouldn't let it bother us so much if we face difficulties and if we face a lack of acceptance. Our job is conveying that message, is to bringing the message in the clearest, most clear fashion possible, giving them the opportunity to hear and understand. You look even in the Quran, Allah talks about when we take prisoners of war, that they should be taken and given security. So what? So that they can hear kalam Allah. So that they can hear the words of Allah. Doesn't even say so they accept the words of Allah. So they can hear them. Our goal is to get the message to them. That's our job. To point the way. We're not the one to put them on that path. We can show them where the path is. We can describe the path for them. But we're never going to be able to put them on that path. That's in the hands of Allah. How many people do we know, whether in our families or in a circle of friends, who have heard many of the same things we've heard, experienced many of the same things we've experienced, but we're here, we're committed to Islam, we're committed to trying to do something for this religion because it's given so much to us. They're elsewhere. Maybe they're very far away from where we are, spiritually and physically. Because Allah is the one who guides the hearts, not us. And it's not our job. Don't take on a mantle that you aren't meant to take. Understand your role. Your role is a vehicle to carry the message to humanity. And to be, in as much as you are able, an example of that message. That will have a much more comprehensive effect than anything else. Dawah to Catholics. Yeah, we'll come back to that one actually. Using our time efficiently in Dawah. If I had one advice for the efficiency of using time, don't try to tell them everything in one go. You have to communicate with them. You have to talk to them. So if you talk to them, if you're talking with them, you're listening to them, you're hearing what they're saying, you're trying to read their body language as well, you'll know how to respond to them. And you'll be able to respond in ways that are most effective. If all you do the minute you see a non-Muslim is you think, okay, I've got to say this, I've got to say this, I've got to say this. You've got this whole program kind of programmed in you. It's like a SD chip that you stick into your head. You've got it programmed with everything you want to say. Oh, non-Muslim, quick, chip. Okay, okay, done. That's not going to work because it's going to be completely out of context. You may say all the wrong things. You're going to be much more effective if you talk to them, if you listen to them, and you have a conversation with them the same way you would hope they would talk to you, like a human being. If they're showing any interest, the work's already been done for you. All you have to do is be there to respond. And you don't have to respond, like I said, you don't have to respond with major intellectual gymnastics, with eloquence, without an accent. None of that matters. The one thing that's going to communicate from you better than anything else is your sincerity. The Arabs, they have a saying that communication from the heart goes straight to the heart. Communication from the tongue only goes to the ears. So speak from your heart and it will reach the people. It will reach the people. Being concise, not too much info. In essence, very much similar to what I had just said now. Not trying to prove a point with people, just trying to give them the information that they need, looking for those opportunities. Many times you can create the opportunities for them to ask the questions. Whether it's how you dress, what you're doing, if you're praying, if you're out somewhere, like if you're at Valley Fair, just happens to come to mind for some reason. You pray out there in the open. Don't be shy. I mean, I don't do it alone necessarily either, but don't be shy. Go, pray. If things are still the same as they used to be the last time I went there. There's trees around the parking lot. You can go there. You can all stand up, line up behind the trees. You can pray. Everybody's going to see you. Some people may ask. Some people may wonder, or if nothing else, they'll wonder. They'll remember. And then as they see stuff, they'll learn more. They'll get more. They'll get braver. But many times people, they don't want to feel like they're being preached to. They don't want to feel like they're being targeted. They love to talk to you. Many of the non-Muslims would love to talk to you. More so than me. They see me and they see me like, oh, he's like one of us. A little hairier perhaps, but he's like one of us. Many, and this is something I was talking to the group before. I said, sometimes you don't understand the barriers people have to accepting your advice or accepting your dawah. Sometimes it could be something as simple as you have an accent. Or more often, from my experience, many people, they actually respond better if you have an accent. You know why? Who can guess? You have an accent, what do you sound like? You sound like a foreigner, right. And Islam is an American religion or it's a foreign religion. So if they hear an accent, they're thinking foreigner, they're thinking they must know something about Islam. That American guy, he can't know anything about Islam. It's not American religion. You'll be surprised. A lot of people, they have this connection. They make these connections. Accent, no accent, but depending on the context. People need to have some credibility. And so, being concise, not too much info. You're listening to them, you're responding to them. Sometimes if you pay attention to a person, they'll give you all the signals in the world about what you need to say. But it's not something you can teach somebody. You can only teach them to be ready and be aware. Use the skills you have as a person in talking to other people, and just use those same skill sets in responding to other people. There's no magic in doing this. This is classes like this oftentimes are because people have this feeling like there's some magical formula that you can do to give dawah or to talk to people. There's no magical formula. Dawah is calling people to Allah. It's a conversation. It's communication. So guess what? Communicate. Just talk. Nothing more complicated than that. The more expectations you make of yourself, the more you're going to make things difficult for yourself. Most of you have enough energy, interest in practicing your faith that when you are asked to talk to someone about it, you're going to find the words. You'll find the words. They may not be the same words I would use, but you know what? That's okay. I'm not the prophet. I'm not a scholar. I'm just another brother who happens to be a little more mouthy than others. Your words are going to be different than mine, are going to be different than the person sitting next to you. But just be yourself and talk from your heart, and you'll find a lot greater success. Now, if it's talking about talking in front of a group, okay, now that's a slightly different story now, because now we're getting into a skill set that isn't something that people are used to. And according to some reports, talking in front of a group is second only in the level of fear that people have to, like, dying. It's like dying talking in front of a group. Even if you think about, I don't know who the talk show hosts are anymore these days, because I really don't want to have that much TV around. But Dave Letterman, or I don't know if Conan's still on or not. These guys, they're talking every night. But believe it or not, every single one of them, right before they come out of the curtain, they're backstage going. They're all nervous as hell. Because it's human nature. You get nervous, no matter how well you prepare. I remember when I used to be working on speeches, and I'd be doing dry runs someplace, I was sweating bullets when I was doing my dry runs. And no one was in the room, or hardly anybody was in the room, and I'm sweating bullets about it. I'm like, oh my God. But then I get in front of a group, any of you who've ever been in one of my khutbahs know what they can sound like. It's like I get possessed. The minute I like, alhamdulillah, okay, I'm possessed. Then something else speaks for me for a while, and it's all over. But I go into a zone. Actually, I remember Sheikh Mamdouh. Some of you may remember him even, who used to be here in the community. He had talked about that one time in a lecture he gave, talking about the intro for the khutbah that you give, the khutbah al-hajj. Says the minute he starts, in alhamdulillah, nahmadahu wa nasta'inahu, he said the minute he starts doing that, he's all like this right beforehand. Actually, if you watch him, sometimes you can see it. He's all like this beforehand, and then the minute he starts saying that, in alhamdulillah, everything just, it comes back down. It's like one of the ni'am of the khutbah al-hajj. It helps calm you down. You get into it, and then take off. So it's very simple. Now, the Catholics, since we got the specific issue of Catholics, Ahmed, where are we?
You got 15 minutes.
Is that 15? What time is it?
15.
What time? What time is it?
It is almost 7:25.
Okay.
Correct. Well, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
20.
All right. So we'll try and do this. We're trying to hit atheists real quick. We're gonna fly on this. So you'll excuse me if this seems like we've set the tape recorder on double speed, so we can cover some of this stuff. Dawah to atheists. And one of the reasons I wanted to make sure we covered this is because, quite frankly, and feel free to disagree with me, my belief is that you actually are probably going to run into more people that fit into this category of atheists, deists, and agnostics than you are Christians or Jews. And we'll get into atheists, deists, and agnostics in a moment here, so to help people understand what each of them are. But I have a feeling that you're going to run into more people that fit these descriptions than you are that fit the Christian and Jewish definition. The reason being is that many of you have probably heard people say that I'm not religious. I'm what? Spiritual. Exactly. That's the phrase. They don't like organized religion. They don't believe, all of these different things. They believe it. They have a concept of God. They believe in, leading a righteous life, whatever that means to them, but they don't identify anything specific to guide them along that path. So I'm spiritual. So, atheist, one who believes there is no God. Oops, sorry. There's an interesting quote here. A couple quotes, actually. There's one quote from Bacon. Not his name, not the food. A little philosophy inclineth men's minds to atheism, but depth in philosophy brighteneth men's minds to religion. So this getting into philosophy, just like these grand thoughts that people have, they're philosophizing about the world and the faith and God and creation, etc. They get a little bit into that. His argument is that leads them to atheism. They reject God. But if they really dig deep into philosophy and understanding the depths of the philosophy of life, etc., that actually guides men back to God rather than away from God. And then another man, his quote was, "By night an atheist half believes a God, or in God." So even atheists, they have a belief in God, like at night, or many of you may have heard the phrase, "No atheists in a foxhole." I saw a couple people about it. No atheists in a foxhole. The idea being that when bullets start flying over your head in the middle of warfare, everyone's calling, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." So that's the idea. So that's atheism. Most of us knew atheism, understand atheism from the beginning. And one of the points that Sheikh Purcell makes is that in truth, if you understand an atheist by definition, there's really very few true atheists in the world. Most of them fall under one of these other categories of deist or agnostic. And we'll explain what those are. A deist or deism is the belief that God exists and created the world, but thereafter assumed no control over it or the lives of people. So God, there is a God, He's the creator of everything, but He has nothing to do with his creation after everything's done. There's no guidance, no control, no whatever. In philosophy, the belief that reason is sufficient to prove the existence of God with the consequent rejection of revelation and authority. So you don't believe in any revelation, you don't believe in any divine authority for your life. There's a God, he created the world, then he stepped back and said, have fun. And then agnostic is one who thinks it is impossible to know whether there is a God or a future life or anything beyond material phenomena. So in theology, in other words, in belief structure, it's the doctrine that God is unknown and unknowable. So we'll leave that alone. So belief in God's existence is the first issue that really becomes crucial. And you don't find a lot of conversation about belief in God, belief in Allah, in the existence of Allah in the Quran, because it's basically was an accepted fact. Most people throughout the history of man have had some faith in God or a God of some kind. So this is not something new, and you find that even Greek philosophers in the past, like Plato and Aristotle, they concluded that there must be a God. The basis of their argument tended to be the whole idea of the evidence of design implies a designer. Part of the reason for that is to say that, most people say, that, the microphone stand, it was made by the microphone stand company. And the microphone stand company was made by some guy with a lot of money. And that guy with a lot of money was made by his mother and father. And the mother and father were made by X, Y, and Z. But you can't keep going like that on and on and on and on and never reach a point of beginning where it stops. You can't have everything had to have something that created it before it, because what happens then is it's what they call an infinite regression. You have to keep going back. This one begot that one, this one begot that one, this one begot that one, and you can't ever stop. And by definition, that means that if you can't ever reach the beginning, there is no beginning, so therefore it doesn't exist. So it's called infinite regression. And Aristotle and Plato basically said that's impossible. You can't have an infinite regression. At some point in time, you have to stop and say, this was the ultimate creator of everything that came after it. And in our terms, we would call that Allah. So this idea of infinite regression doesn't work. The idea of design and a designer pointing to Allah. So that's not surprising to find that throughout society. The only societies that really historically have ever been built on the idea that there is no God is the communist countries, because the communism, one of the founding principles of communism was atheism. And there's an article here, I'm not actually going to go into this, but long story short, there's an article here that you can find out about where there was some experiments that were done back in 1997 where they identified what they called at that time a God spot in the brain. What it is that there's a cluster of neurons and wiring within the brain, in the frontal part of the brain, where they were doing some experiments on epileptics, and they compared their brains with very religious people when they would stick electrical probes into their brains and stimulate this certain area of the brain. All of them, the epileptics who had these experiences and the very religious people, they were reacting the same way to the probes when they were described. So they found that this section of wiring in the brain, it seemed to have a direct relationship to these religious feelings and experiences that people were having. And so they dubbed it the God spot. And they called it being hardwired for belief in God, was the way they described it. So it's just kind of an aside that he threw in there. I've read some of the research papers on this stuff. The guys that actually did this research, they try to really say, no, that's not what we meant, that's not what we were trying to show. But still, people use it for that discovery. And it's not to say it's not relevant. I mean, to say that there's a part of the brain that if you stimulate it, you have these massive religious experiences, that could, Allah knows best, be part of that fitrah that we've been endowed with, where there's a belief in God that's inculcated in us from birth. Allah knows best. And then the quote verse here, which we want to share with you, is "Am khulaqu min ghayri shay'in am humul khaliqun am khalaqu samawati wal ardi bal la yuqinun." Were they created from nothing, or did they create themselves, or did they create the heavens and earth? Indeed, they are uncertain. So this is really addressing the arguments that many people put up about the lack of God. Is that there couldn't be any creator. You say, were they created from nothing? Was there nothing and then somehow they were created, which is ludicrous because, something can't be created from nothing. It's logically impossible. And then the other one, or did they create themselves? Again, in order to create themselves, they would have had to exist before they were created. But if they were existing before they were created, that's a logical oxymoron. You can't be both existing and non-existing at the same time. Or did they create the heavens and the earth? So, they had no responsibility for any of these things. Indeed, they are uncertain. They have no certainty about what they're doing. So, this is one of the evidences that Allah uses to, to show this. And he talks about infinite regression. Design indicates a designer. We talked about that. Darwinism fails. Oh, this is an interesting point. Darwinism fails. One of the attempts to explain the origin of life using Darwin's theory was that creating the precursors of life from non-living chemicals. In other words, the sky of the earth was filled with chemicals at a certain point before there was any life, at least according to Darwin's theory. And through the lightning and the other things that were going on, it created amino acids, which were like the building blocks of life. And so they've tried to do this and experimentally replicate this process to prove that this theory works. And so they've done some of this where they've passed electricity through these gases, and some amino acids have been created. But he says here, until today, 5 of the 20 amino acids common to all living beings have resisted human attempts to create them artificially. In other words, there's been no way for us to duplicate that. So that this theory is correct, and that that life comes from this meaningless, abstract process is not able to be proven at all. So. And then the fitra, the natural belief in God. So this is something that we already were talking about. So this is the Prophet's explanation here, where he says, should say on the day, surely we were unaware that we had no idea that you, Allah, were God. So this is talking about when Allah in the Quran is speaking to the people. He says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظهورهم ذرياتهم وأشهدهم على أنفسهم ألست بربكم قالوا بلى شهدنا أن تقولوا يوم القيامة إنا كنا عن هذا غافلين أو تقولوا إنما أشرك آباؤنا من قبل وكنا ذرية من بعدهم أفتهلكنا بما فعل المبتلون. When your Lord drew forth from the loins of the children of Adam their descendants and made them testify concerning themselves, saying, Am I not your Lord? They said, Yes, we testify to it. This is, in case you should say on the day of judgment, we were unaware of this. Or in case you should say, it was our ancestors who made partners with Allah, and we were only their descendants. Will you destroy us for what those liars did? So this is Allah stating in the Quran that He drew the children of Adam from His back and assembled them all on this plane in the heavens and made them all witness to the fact, saying, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? So every single child of Adam testified before their birth that Allah is their Lord. And so this is one of the explanations that the Prophet ﷺ gave to explain the fitrah. That this is amongst the aspects of the fitrah that we've been created with. And then talking about the times of crises when the atheists in a foxhole, and quoting in the Quran Where it says, إِذَا أَدْرَكُوا أَنَّهُ غَرَقُوا قَالَ آمَنْتُ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا الَّذِي آمَنَتْ بِهِ بَنُو إِسْرَائِيلَ وَأَنَّا مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. This is Fir'aun as he's drowning in the Red Sea, saying, when being drowned caught him, he cried, I believe that none has the right to be worshipped but he in whom the children of Israel believe, and I am one of the Muslims. So at the time of crisis, when he felt that death was absolutely certain, which indeed it was, he cries out. But Allah tells him, it's too late. Your chance is done. And one of the interesting facts about that is that according to some of the information I've read is that one of the mummies that has been recovered from Egypt is, they believe, the mummy of this pharaoh, and there's evidence of drowning in the mummy that they found, that it was sufficient, large amounts of water that had been imbibed into the flesh, which showed that this may be proof of that being the pharaoh that was the one for the Red Sea, and evidence of that incident in the Quran and in the Bible of Pharaoh being drowned in the Red Sea. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. And so, now, simple steps for dawah to atheists, agnostics, and deists. Okay, so this is the part we'll stick with. For deists, he describes them as confused. Clear up the doubts for them. So find out the reason for their confused beliefs. Because one of the things that Sheikh Bilal talks about is that many of these people that reject faith, they have a reason. And many times it's because there's been some calamity or catastrophe in their life, or the life of someone dear to them, that's caused them to give up hope and give up faith in anything outside of themselves. So you find out a bad experience, etc., and you focus on Tawheed, specifically the Lord of Lordship and of worship. Then you ask deists, like, if Islam is good for you, that is fine. The most important thing is to be good. Oh, this is the deist, I'm sorry. If Islam is good for you, that's fine. The most important thing is to be good. Then the question to them at that point would be, how do you define good? Because good to a deist is a relativistic thing. It changes with time, it changes with their mood. There's no stable definition for what is good. For a Muslim and for a believer, the definition of what is good is simple. It's what Allah, God determines is good. So there's a static, stable definition. You don't find these changes like you do with democracy, or you do with all of these other confusions that are passed off as intellectual. A deist might say, I can't accept organized religion. It's full of corruption. Sound familiar? You hear stuff like this all the time. And then the question from us could be something like, would you prefer a disorganized religion of your own making? Which is, in essence, what they wind up with, because they're just picking and choosing. Some of you may know what they call New Age people. The New Agers, they love to take from everywhere and anything. They'll take a little Hindu, a little Buddhist, a little Islam, a little this, a little that. A lot of some of the converts to Islam these days, especially amongst the white people, not in this community so much, but in other communities, you find a lot of the white people that come to Islam, they come through the angle of Sufism, because they're coming from kind of a New Age angle, and so the Sufi stuff gets really attractive to them, and so they'll gravitate towards that because it doesn't have the same appearance of restriction and rules and regulations that the other stuff does. So, a deist might say, God is love. Very familiar statement you say. Then the question should be, should he love Hitler, Pol Pot, Genghis Khan? Pick your, murderous killer, or degenerate or whatever.
Pick your target.
And pick your target. You can pick your target. But whoever, this person, this personality you can think of that everyone agrees is just evil. Should he love Pharaoh? Should he love Hitler? Should he love? We could pick anybody. Some people, some Egyptians want to say, should he love Hosni Mubarak?
I don't know.
SubhanAllah, may Allah guide him. Deists might say, what kind of God would put good people in the hellfire? Is Mother Teresa going to hell? You hear stuff like this sometimes. Our question to him might be, your focus is on the rights of people, but what about the rights of Allah? Many times people don't think about this. They're so focused on themselves that they don't think about, shouldn't Allah have some rights, have something that he should be able to expect from us? And so that's something that many times people don't even think about. You know, the purpose for which you were created. You know, do you think about that? And most of the time, many people, they have no concept of what the purpose of life is from a scriptural standpoint, because most scriptures don't speak to the purpose of life directly the way the Quran does. Quran is very specific, you know, in saying that, you know, verily I created, you know, the jinn and men in order to worship me. And this is the most oft-quoted verse regarding the purpose of life. And you explain the purpose. Creation, you know, is for a reason, is based on a reason. So help them find the courage to submit and surrender themselves for his honor. Encourage them as the prophet. Now, for the atheist, describes them as arrogant. And he says, true atheists are very few in the world. They're mostly deists or agnostics. So clear doubts, find out the reasons for their disbelief, bad experiences, etc. Focus on Tawheed. And use Quranic arguments to prove God's existence. Truthfully, that's the best argument you can have. Just use the Quranic arguments. You can try all the other stuff, but in the end, you could get yourself in a box if you try to go with any of the other stuff. If you stick with the Quranic arguments, they're usually pretty simple, pretty straightforward, pretty logical, and you know they're either going to say, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense, or they're going to say, whatever, go away. And you just leave it. And that's one thing in Dawah that you should really be able to understand and be willing to accept for yourself. If you face too much opposition, people start to make fun of you, or people start to attack you during your efforts to try to make Dawah to them. You know, they start to be very, very low manners in the way they're interacting with you. Leave. Walk away from it. You're not. It's not like the minute you start the conversation with somebody, you're duty bound to finish the conversation until they walk away. Some of these people have very long patience to sit there and argue to the ground.
That's a question from the audience.
Okay. Question is, I have a lot of non-Muslim friends, but do not know how to initiate Dawah, especially when they do not ever ask me questions. Oh, when they do not ever ask me questions. Beliefs to Islam or seemed interested. Where should I begin? One of the things that I was reading, this is actually kind of a good suggestion, I've used this sometimes, is that you try to create the opportunities for them to ask questions or to be interested. You know, whether it's like praying out in the open, or like even making dua where you just slightly above a whisper where they might be able to hear it. Something like, just to expose them gradually. You can try starting the conversations. Oftentimes those don't go over really well, especially if you're not in the habit of having religious conversations with a friend, because the minute you have a religious conversation with a friend you don't normally have religious conversations with, guess what happens? Well, what did they up to? They immediately sense that something's up because they know that this is not our normal conversation mode. It's the same reason I don't have very direct conversations with most of my family, because most of my family, we didn't grow up having religious discussions in the house. That just wasn't our style. So for me to just suddenly sit down and say, all right, we're going to talk about Islam today. Yeah, I'd probably get hit over the head with something. So I don't do that. I try to come at it from the left or from the right, and be a little indirect in the way I approach it. And sometimes I get, like my mother especially is really good. She'll ask me questions. Even my brother, he asks me questions sometimes. And he was of the ones that were still speaking to me. He was one of them that was kind of reluctant and kind of poo-pooed the idea. He wasn't exactly negative to the idea, but he just kind of laughed at it because he knew what I was like growing up. So it was kind of the dichotomy from what I used to do to what I was trying to do was kind of weird for him, especially since he was there with me some of the times when we were doing the stuff we were doing. So, but he's gotten to the point over the years where he'll call me sometimes out of the blue. He's like, "Don't you guys do XYZ? Or don't you guys just out of the blue sometimes I'll get a phone call because of one thing or another. It's very strange, but it's gotten to that point. And I gave him a Quran, I gave my mother a Quran, so You know, I believe in doing that because I believe the Quran is the best dawah tool you've got. For me, the Quran was the clincher. For a lot of people I knew, some of my students in the past, a lot of them, for them, the Quran was the clincher as well. Because in the end, the Quran is one of the best arguments and the truest evidences about the religion. You know, no matter how eloquent, no matter how good our memory is, etc., we're going to make mistakes. We're going to flub things up. We're going to say it in a way that doesn't reach people. It's a lot easier for people to pick up a book that seems completely innocuous and completely unchallenging, and, you know, like unimposing, and to read it of their own volition. And then their hearts tend to be open. And so stuff they read, they're actually willing to actually think about. Whereas if somebody's saying it to them in a setting where it's kind of direct, they know it's being directed at them, it's almost as if a defense mechanism goes up and they're going to fight it off. Even if they think it makes a lot of sense, they may fight it off for the sake of appearances, because it might not look good for them. That's why I told the group last week, I told them, I said, what you want to do, especially at the Dawah booth, is you want to give people an excuse to stop. So the Dawah brochures are one of the excuses. Hopefully there'll be some snacks or some drinks or something like that that people can share. And that from booths I've worked at in the past, we had a bucket of lemonade, mint lemonade. It was a hit all around the fair that we were at, and people were coming, going, "Do you still have any more of that lemonade?" That was their excuse to come. Once they were there, they might ask some questions. They might hang out, browse a few of the brochures, anything like that. That's good. I mean, you don't have to feel like you have to strike conversation with every single person that comes. If they just come, they want to look at some of the brochures, they want to, maybe pick up a Quran or something like that, and that's all they seem to want to do. They don't really want to have a conversation. Let them. Because if they have a neutral experience when they come to the booth, but they take some literature with them, guess what? Chalk that up as a win. Because if they took that literature, they'll go home and they're more than likely going to read at least some of it. And so chances are you're going to have the opportunity. But if you give them an excuse to stop, then there's not this like stigma about, I stopped and talked to the Muslims today. They'll be okay. It's like there was some really good lemonade at the fair. They can pass it off on something else. So I got a free Quran today. As some of them were saying, the free Qurans would go over really well.
Let's finish with this question.
Did Jesus say he is God in the Bible? No, actually, he refers to himself frequently as the Son of Man. He almost never refers to himself as the Son of God, and never in the sections that we can trust to be more authentic than others. There's one particular verse in, I think it's 1 John, if I remember correctly, that in one particular version of the Bible called the Revised Standard Version that was published in 1951 and I believe again in 1973. The introduction to this version of the Bible, this translation that was done, was that it was a conglomeration of 50 denominations of Christian churches and a number of biblical scholars that went and found the oldest manuscripts available. And they compared everything. They did very diligent research, etc. And in the course of doing all of this, the particular verse in 1 John that was referring to it, I don't remember the actual wording of the verse, but it's the only verse that even remotely refers to the Trinity in specific language. That particular verse is taken out. There's a footnote put down below that says that particular, that verse, I'm paraphrasing, that verse was found to be not present in the oldest manuscripts or something to that effect. So it was an addition that was added later on. And that was the strongest evidence for the Trinity in the entire Bible. As far as him saying he's God, he's never said that. Him saying he's the Son of God, he never said that. As a matter of fact, I was just reading something about, actually it was probably when I was preparing, but the term Son of God in Hebrew usage is extremely similar to the phrase Waliullah. And if you know Arabic well enough to know wali Allah and what it actually is signifying, it doesn't mean son. It doesn't mean any physical relationship of any kind. It's a nearness. It's an affinity and an association with God because of the righteousness of the person and the faith of that person. And the meaning of the phrase "son of God" in Hebrew scripture is essentially the same. And that's why many of you may have heard the phrase that Jesus is described by Christians as the only begotten Son of God. If you look in the Bible, in the New Testament, Psalms 2, verse 7, there's a part in there, I don't remember the exact wording, but it basically is talking to David, to Dawah, saying that he is the Son of God who I begot. So he's using exactly the same terminology. He is begotten, he is the Son of God. And that's Dawah. So how can Jesus be the only begotten Son of God when the Bible itself testifies to another begotten Son of God? If we take it to mean what the Christians would have us take it to mean, that would be a contradiction. If you take it to mean what linguistically it appears to mean, it would make sense. Because you can have more than one friend of God, or even saying a begotten friend of God. Because it's not the same thing. So this idea of a begotten Son of God, is only begotten Son of God, fundamentally false. Have them answer the question about that verse about that David in the Psalms and see what they say. Most of them don't even know it's there.
It's not the only place either.
No, yeah,
There's many
and
places.
Ahmed is saying it's not the only place, and I don't doubt it. There's lots of places where the children of Israel are called sons of God. The angels are called sons of God. There's, I think Solomon or Jacob is referred to as a son of God. So lots of people are called son of God in the Bible. So that raises a big question mark, because you start to have to do a whole bunch of gymnastics to explain whether or not Jesus is truly the only begotten Son of God. Which, of course, as Muslims we would categorically deny and say is absolutely false. All right, unless there's any enormously burning question in people's minds or hearts right now, I've been asked to wrap things up. So, Sean, yes.
What about Trinity when you say
That was relating to that verse that I was talking about that had been taken out in that Revised Standard Version. That was the only strong evidence for the Trinity in the entire Bible, and that was determined by that group of 50 denominations of churches and numerous biblical scholars. I don't remember how many right now, and they determined that was an apocrypha. It was inauthentic. It was from a later edition that was not part of the original text. So it was, and in addition, or to use an Arabic terminology, it would be ma'udul. Yes.
How do you balance being on defense and being on offense? If you keep telling them, like, if Islam is not like this, Islam is not like that, you're never going to get to the message of Islam.
Right. No, absolutely.
And, yeah, so I'm just wondering how to balance it.
Tell them what it is. Don't even. I mean, you may have to talk about what Islam is not, because they may start off with that. You know, Muslims are all terrorists. Actually, I don't know how many of you on Facebook there was something that went around recently about a 10-day manhunt for an armed gunman in, I forget which state it was. Arkansas. You know it then, obviously. He had made very open and public threats to kill the government and government officials. He wanted to take down America, etc. And very few people have heard this story. Why? He's not Muslim. But he's a terrorist. Very definitely a terrorist. He's killed people. He's threatened to kill more people. He's gunning for politicians and government officials, etc. But of course, it's not being reported as widely because, that's one of the things that sometimes you can turn questions around on people and show them, how I hate to say it this way, but how ignorant the question truly is, because it belies a blind acceptance of the stuff that they hear. Take one version of it. It's like, point up, you can bring up other stories, but yeah, just, you have to answer what a person starts off with, but then try to turn it to what Islam is. And just contrast what they're saying, like, saying Islam is terrorist, give the examples of, the history in Southeast Asia. No armies ever came there, and it's stayed Muslim the entire time. Or you want a good example of how Muslims, because people that try to make the accusation that Muslims are bloodthirsty, they always want to kill all the non-Muslims. They want to convert everybody. It's either convert or die or something like that. One of the best arguments against that is you tell them, okay, how about Andalusia, southern Spain, when it was controlled by the Muslims for 700 years? And to this day, even then and to this day, it was not a Muslim majority country. How about India, which was ruled by the Muslims for 1,000 years? And to this day, then and now, was not a Muslim majority country. If they were bloodthirsty killers and telling everybody it's either convert to Islam or die, you'd have 99.9% Muslims and 0.1% rolling around decapitated heads. But the reality is that's not the case. If you want to talk about conversions, forced conversions, look into the history of the early church, especially in the North and Central America, and what they did coming in and absolutely forced conversions, absolutely threatened with death for the cross. It's no hidden fact. Most historians who are worth their weight will tell you very honestly about the atrocities committed by Christian missionaries coming to the Americas. No.
We have a limited time.
Any books on that topic?
Yes, I'm sure that I honestly can't think of one off the top of my head right now, but it is available. I'm trying to think if there's a good resource. Really, just start with like a history department at one of the universities, and it could probably start pointing you in the right direction.
Radio, they say the highest suicidal rates amongst Americans are white males because they have the wealth, have education, but at the same time there's something missing in their life, and they end up killing themselves. So I'm wondering, like during the fair time, do we focus on, focus on them because they're the highest looking for answers?
Not necessarily, because there's, and I don't know the demographics of what we run into at the fair. From what I've heard, it's probably going to be pretty lily white, from what I've heard.
Yep.
I've confirmation of that. But I wouldn't focus on that. You probably aren't going to have much choice. It sounds like that's going to be 99.9% of what you see. But whoever comes up is, you'll want to take the opportunity to talk to, because most of the, suicide is at an alarming rate in this country to begin with. And suicide isn't always somebody taking, killing, putting the car in park and turning on the engine and gassing themselves in the garage, taking an overdose of pills, or putting a gun to their head or in their mouth. Sometimes suicide can be as simple as they smoke themselves to death, they drink themselves to death, they decide to live a violent lifestyle because they have no zest for life, no love for life anymore, so they do everything they can to have themselves die early. There's a whole bunch of things that are truly suicidal behaviors that aren't defined as suicide. And it's a real big problem within society. A lot of this stuff, people are looking for all these thrills, the X Games and everything else that you see and things like that, these thrill seekers. It's because Yusha actually made the point, I think, when we were there last week in the seminar. He was talking about the pit in people's stomach that feels so empty, it feels so so cold, and they want to fill it with something. but everything they put inside of it is impermanent and is wispy as air, and so it passes away as soon as they put it inside, and so they feel empty all over again. And the only thing that fills it for them is true, real faith and real meaning in their life. And that's something that they haven't been taught how to find, because most people they no longer have a spiritual language. They don't know how to talk about spirituality. They don't know how to pursue it in an intelligent and healthy way.
On. Over, please.
I've been told I'm done.
Jazakallah khair.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
Jazakallah khair. Okay. Everyone, excuse me, please. I know you need to listen more, but we have limited time. Salat al-Maghrib will be here, so we need to leave or just clean up the area. But before finish, the talk, Jazakallah alf khair, for what you have done, really good information, and Jazakallah all of you khair, for coming to this fi sabilillah subhanahu wa ta'ala for da'wah. I just want to go through little information really quick about now, as you get snapshot of the training. We want to talk about, or a snapshot about what's the Dawah building blocks. Dawah building blocks is started 2 years ago, and with few people, limited resources. And when we start, we thought, we're going to just take care and we're going to grow up little by little. Unfortunately, the workload became suddenly very heavy. According to the activities we have. It's out of our hand. So we found out, yes, we need more people to sign up. Committed people. Committed, and people have sincerity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever, a week, whatever you can do. We all busy, but that would be great, it's fi sabilillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So basically, let me go through, what's the Dawah team about. The Dawah team, as I say, started 2 years ago, and dealing with many different activities, like fairs. Summer activities. Last year we went to Hennepin County Fair, and we distribute, limited copy of the Quran. Some question from the people, we answer the question. And then Ramsey County Fair. And let me ask, how many people in Ramsey County Fair last year was with us? I have 2 people over here. And we have really good experience over there. I'm going to talk at the end of the talk too, the experience, what we have with the people, and what you should do in Ramsey County Fair, especially for the people sign up on the sheet. They are willing to volunteer for Ramsey County Fair. Other activities like these state fairs and Ramsey County Fair, Hennepin Fair, alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, we distributed Ramsey County Fair 500 copies of Quran. Am I correct?
I think so.
It's less.